Well, hello again. Welcome to Lesson 3 of Writing Through the Wardrobe. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about that idea that you may have heard of before from other writing teachers, and that's showing and telling. But we're going to talk about, then we're going to talk about description, and I'll also be touching on the idea of imagery and figurative language, which have some significant overlaps but aren't the same thing. So let's go ahead and get started here. Showing and telling. I know I've already touched on this idea. It's one of the great cliches of writing teachers. Show, don't tell. Well, I want to make sure I'm clear on what we even mean when we say showing versus telling. And then I also I want to offer some nuance here, let's say, because that advice, show, don't tell, is good as far as it goes. But the truth is, sometimes telling is exactly what you need. But we'll get to that when we get to it. What is showing? When we say show, don't tell, what we really mean is showing just means you are giving to the reader what anybody would see if they were present in the scene. And if there was a video camera set up in the room, whatever that video camera would see, that's showing, okay? So a video camera can see what people are, what their movements and gestures are. That can see what their actions are, how they interact with one another. It can hear their dialogue. Also anything like, I know a video camera can't tell you what things smell like, but any sensory information that's coming in counts as showing. Again, what would anybody see if they were there? What would anybody experience if they were there in the scene? That is showing. If you're giving background information of how we found ourselves in this room, and the narrator is just sort of giving background information, that's not showing, that's telling. On the other hand, if a character is saying, well, here's how we all ended up in this room, and it's dialogue, well, actually that's showing. So if showing is what anyone would see if they were present in the scene, what is telling? Well, telling is everything else. Okay, any kind of explanations, any kind of background information, any kind of eavesdropping on characters' thoughts, that's all telling. So our modes of telling: summarizing, explaining, commenting, moving backward and forward in time. Like anytime you say 2 days later, right, you are entering into telling mode. Anytime you describe characters' inner states, that you just say, Aaron felt sad and lonely, that's telling. Now, on the other hand, if we see Aaron sitting dejectedly in a corner, looking at the picture of his long-lost dog or whatever, now you're showing Aaron being sad and lonely, okay? Or if Aaron says, I just, I've really been feeling sad and lonely lately because I miss my dog, right? That's also showing, because that is, if you were in the room with Aaron, you could hear him saying that. So those are our modes of telling. Now, this is a paraphrase of something Flannery O'Connor said. The eye is an organ of judgment. And I know I touched on this the other day, not the other day, in I think it was lesson 2. I didn't use this phrase, but we were talking about the importance of letting your reader judge. So when you, telling, as I said, telling is anything that you're doing that is not what the reader would see if they happen to be in the same room with the characters, or I say the same room, obviously if they're outside, then I just with the characters. But that doesn't mean you're giving up on depicting emotional states, or, like, in other words, if you were just to say, Aaron was sad and lonely, and Linda was happy, and that's just telling, because you're eavesdropping on those people's inner lives. But obviously, there are ways. I mean, I say obviously. Let me just say there are ways to demonstrate people's inward states or big ideas without going into telling mode by showing. And this idea that I as an organ of judgment is key to that, because think about this. When you see a person who you know to be sad and lonely, how do you know that? How do you know they're sad and lonely? Well, they may tell you, you may see them, you may see their posture. It is your eyeballs and your ears that tell you that person is sad and lonely. And so the question is, I can tell you Aaron is sad, but what I can also do is give you the sensory evidence that tells me that Aaron is sad. All right, and that's how, and that's what Flannery O'Connor meant when she spoke of the eye as an organ of judgment. All right, when and the way she put it was, and I'm paraphrasing, most of us think that you've got your sensory inputs on the one hand, and you've got your judgments or your feelings on the other hand, and those are two different things. But the truth is, the way we navigate the world is we see things, hear things, smell things, feel things, touch. I'm going through the five senses here, and all those inputs come into our brain, into our mind through our eyes and through our nose and through our sensory organs, and then our judgment goes to work on it. So if you were to see a person driving a big SUV, reading their phone and putting on lipstick all at the same time, and then they almost ran over a toddler, riding their tricycle on the sidewalk, you would immediately go into judgment mode. You'd say, that horrible person endangered that child because they were too busy looking at their phone and putting on lipstick and driving this big SUV, and they almost killed that kid. All right? You go straight into judgment mode just based on what you saw with your eyeballs, right? There's no narrator in your head going, that's a really horrible person, right? You immediately go into judgment mode, and you didn't need any narrator to explain anything to you. And that's what it means to say that the eye is an organ of judgment. So you as a writer, if you can show the right things to your reader is going to make the judgments that you're hoping they're going to make, okay? You aren't taking well, sometimes you are taking a risk, and in some sense there is a risk because you can't be sure that your reader is going to arrive at the judgments you want them to arrive at. But the truth is, if you declare to them what judgments they're supposed to have, they're going to resist you. But if you can present them the right kind of scene, and show them, and they arrive at those judgments themselves, those judgments are going to stick. Those feelings are going to stick. It's funny. If I tell you Aaron is sad and lonely, you're probably not going to feel sad and lonely. You might feel pity for Aaron, maybe. Probably not. But if I depict a scene in which we can enter into whatever it is that's making Aaron sad, instead of I declare Aaron is sad, I show you what happened that he's now sad about, I've got a good chance of making you feel sad too. And that's why that's why your writing teachers, and that's why I, as a writing teacher, tell people, show, don't tell. I don't really mean it, because sometimes telling is perfect and exactly what you need. And I mean, again, think about at the beginning of, to return to that beginning of Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, there once were 4 children named Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, and they were, because the air raids went to the professor's house. All right, that's all telling, and that's really helpful, right? I need that background information. I don't need to immediately necessarily to have my judgment engaged. I'm okay as a reader. Thank you for that background information. Now, if the whole book were just background information, that wouldn't be a very good book, and we wouldn't be talking about The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe if it stayed in telling mode. But it doesn't stay in telling mode. It goes pretty quickly into showing mode, and that's why we find this book so compelling. Now, a related idea, these terms aren't interchangeable, but showing tends to be in scene and telling tends to be out of scene. I say tends to, this isn't, again, these aren't interchangeable, but it's also related to the idea of distant narration versus closer narration. And so I'm gonna wear these first lines of the story out. But once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This is a story about something that happened to them, et cetera, et cetera. All right, that's out of scene. We're not in the room with those children. We're just sort of getting a summary. And then, again, I think this is page 3. As soon as they said goodnight to the professor, and gone upstairs on the first night, the boys came into the girls' room and they all talked it over. Now we are in the room with them, right? I mean, literally, it says they're in the girls' room and so are we. And so when Peter says we fall on our feet and no mistake, we're in scene and we're being shown, not told, okay? So this is out of scene and in telling mode, and this is in scene and in showing mode, right? If you had a video camera set up in the room, this is what you'd see. There is no video camera that can show you this, okay? So hopefully that helps illustrate both the difference between showing and telling and the difference between in scene and out of scene. I think I am telling the truth when I say out of scene storytelling is always telling, but you can be in scene and still be a little telly, right? You can be in scene and maybe you're talking about the characters' inner lives or whatever, and so that's technically telling, but you are in scene. Okay, so that's what I want to. That's a really important distinction to make sure you understand the difference between showing and telling. When your writing teachers say to you, "Show, don't tell," what they really mean is, all things being equal, it's better to show than to tell. But sometimes it's better to show. Sometimes it's better to tell. Okay? So I'm always trying to get my students to do more showing, but that doesn't really mean that I never want them to tell. Okay? So when we say show, don't tell, what we mean is do more showing, do less telling, but when it's time to tell, have no shame. Okay? All right, let's see. What do we got now? All right, let's talk about imagery. What do we mean by imagery? Imagery is language that involves the 5 senses. So you remember I was just talking about showing. I was just talking about the idea that when you show, you are engaging the reader's sensory, the parts of their brain that handle the senses. So you're showing them things, you're giving them sounds to hear, including dialogue. Maybe you are talking about the smells in the room. Sometimes you can talk about taste, depending on what kind of, if you're talking about a feast, then I hope you are talking about the tastes. And then the sense of touch. And I think it's really helpful to think in terms of texture, because sometimes it's hard to know, when you hear about this, using the sense of touch, how do you incorporate that? Well, usually you incorporate it by talking about the textures. It felt rough, or it felt smooth, or it felt whatever. Or maybe the temperature. That's also the sense of touch. Okay, so when we say imagery, what we're really talking about is doubling down on concrete sensory language. Literally, what about this scene appeals to the 5 senses? And by the way, when you're talking about imagery, I'm talking about not using the kind of language that is emotionally loaded. So, if I want, this might be a great example, but if I describe somebody's dress as they had a fancy dress. All right, fancy is not a sensory word. That's just kind of a feeling word, right? It's not. What you want to do is, if you're going to describe a fancy dress in terms of imagery or in terms of showing instead of telling, you really have to hunker down and say, what does that dress really look like? It was red, taffeta, off the shoulder. You can talk about what what actually comes into your eyeballs, when you see that dress. Don't talk to me about it being fancy or lovely or awe-inspiring, right? You're talking about feelings there. Imagery is about the actual 5 senses. Now, if you do it well, then your reader will feel, awe, or whatever it is that you're trying to get them. I mean, it may be hard to make your reader feel awe over a dress when you're just describing it. So that's why I said it might be a bad example. But anyway, imagery, language that involves the 5 senses. Now, figurative language, well, we'll get to that in a minute. Figurative language imagery is sometimes figurative, but what I want you as a writer to get really good at, whether you use similes and metaphors and other kinds of figurative language or not, the truth is some people are better at that than others, and I don't even know how to teach people to get better at using similes and metaphors. But the good news is you can be a really, really good writer and not worry about that. Okay, what you do need to get good at is really thinking about what is it that I am, what are the 5 senses, how are the 5 senses being engaged in a descriptive, in a moment that you're trying to describe, and then do that. All right, so let's just look at a couple of passages. On the sledge, driving the reindeer, sat a fat dwarf who would have been about 3 feet high if he had been standing. He was dressed in polar bear's fur, and on his head he wore a red hood with a long tassel hanging down from its point. His huge beard covered his knees and served him instead of a rug. All right, this is not an earth-shattering passage, is it? It's just a nice little description that we can really envision. Okay, now notice that that we've got color. We've got a red hood with a tassel. We've got polar bear's fur, which gives us a nice little texture, right? You've got your idea of what polar bear fur feels like. Although I've never touched polar bear fur, but I've got some ideas of what it might be like. And then we've got this long beard. My point here is, this is not, you don't have to be a genius to write this, okay? I think this is really great. I love this little paragraph. I love this description, and I think you can write this well. All you have to do is pay attention to the physical facts of what's going on. I think this is a continuation. Yeah, okay. Continuing that same passage, the sledge was a fine sight as it came sweeping toward Edmund with the bells jingling and the dwarf cracking its whip and the snow flying up on each side of it. Okay, so we've already appealed to the visual, right? And by the way, when you're describing, the visual is kind of the low-hanging fruit. You just about can't do without it. You've got to be serious about the visual. Visual imagery. Now, sometimes your character's in the dark and they can't see anything, so you better get good at textures and sounds too. When Lucy goes into the wardrobe at the end of chapter 1, she can't see anything. She just has to feel. She feels down and she thinks it's mothballs, and it turns out to be something cold and hard, cold and powdery and soft. And she's expecting to feel fur, but instead she feels prickly branches. Okay, so sometimes sensory language is, you don't have the option of doing the visual because the person's in the dark. But that's kind of the exception. Usually you're going to be talking about the visual imagery. So we've covered that on the previous screen with the dwarf with his long beard and his red hat and the tassel and all that kind of stuff. But look what else, and then we also talked about the texture of the polar bear fur. Now we've also got bells jingling, and we've got whip cracking, and then I love this image of the snow flying up on either side. So I already mentioned the 5 senses. The 6th thing you need to think about when you're describing things and using imagery is motion. If you can make things move in your descriptions, good things are going to happen. And so even the dwarf cracking his whip, that's a sound, but it's also a motion, right? You can see that, and then the snow flying up on each side of it makes, we already can see the sledge going this way, but now we've got motion going this way. This is kind of a funny example, but when I was growing up, if you watched a fast food commercial on television, it would just show the burger or the chicken or whatever, and it'd be a still shot, and then the announcer would be talking about it or whatever. And they might say, the quarter pounder with cheese, and with the words on the page. Well, in the 90s, I think it was the 90s, somebody discovered if we can make this food move, the people it will engage your attention more. You know, so chicken sandwiches don't really move that much in real life unless you're in the middle of a food fight. But if you look at fast food commercials now, the food's always in motion. The chicken is, you know, flying into the bucket, or the, you know, you'll see hamburger ads where the hamburger kind of thumps down on the counter, and the ingredients kind of bounce. So somebody discovered that if you can make food move, you can engage people's interest. And so now you never see static food on fast food commercials. You'll start noticing now that I've said it. And that is just a writing principle too. If you can introduce movement like snow flying up on either side of it, that's you suddenly have engaged your reader that much more. So this kind of writing, I think, is brilliant. And you don't have to be a genius to do it. You can do this. Pay attention to what you see, what you hear. Is there a way to work in a texture? Is there a way to work in some movement? Your writing will come alive when you do that. So it will start to feel, your whole goal, I say your whole goal, okay, not your whole goal, but a vital goal in your writing is to make the world, when you're telling a story, you want to make that world feel like a place that feels like a real place to your reader. And paying attention to the sensory is so important. And the truth is, I mean, now we're not seeing a lot of it here, but those descriptions also contain emotional content. I mean, again, not so much here. That's not so important here. We'll see some of this later. And let me mention one thing. I'd said don't use emotional, and I should have used the word also language of judgment in your descriptions. What I should have said is use them sparingly, because you see that description, fine sight, that's not sensory, that is a kind of an emotional, it kind of is talking about how it makes you feel when you see it. So let me just say this about using that kind of language. And as you can see, what happened is Lewis doesn't just say it was a fine sight. He shows us exactly what it looks like, and you can feel that it was a fine sight, right? And so this is an example of telling rather than showing. But it's telling that is then backed up by showing, right? We have two words of telling in this long bit of showing. And you can do that, you can do that all day long. That's a great example of that. That one little bit of telling, I think, is very helpful, right? Okay, so, let's talk about one way to describe things is with similes and metaphors, okay? And a simile is a comparison using the word like or as. This is the kind of thing that you learn, again, you probably learned it in 5th grade if you didn't learn it before that. One thing I want to say about similes and metaphors is the purpose of simile and metaphor is not to make things more ethereal. It's not to make things float off and be less concrete. It's actually to make them more concrete. So think about this simile. And by the way, Lewis doesn't use a ton of simile in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's really surprising how little he uses. Where he really uses it is in his essays. And the reason he uses it in his essays is because he's trying to take big ideas that are kind of floating out here and bring them down to earth where we can make sense of them. I think I'm going to talk about that in a later lesson. But look at this. Her face was white. Not merely pale, but white like snow or paper or icing sugar, except for her very red mouth. Okay, think about that simile and what it's doing here. That simile, and the simile, of course, is white like snow or paper or icing sugar. What is Lewis accomplishing with that simile? Well, you could sort of make some cases of, well, when it says she's white like snow, that shows that she's cold inside, or what. You can say that kind of stuff. Maybe if this were a literature class, that's what we would do. As a writing person, here's what as far as I'm concerned, here's the thing he definitely does. He conveys to us that we're not talking about just light skin. We're talking about white. And so that simile, white like snow, white like paper, white like icing sugar, really helps us envision. So this is imagery. It's really just helping us envision what she actually looked like. This is appealing to the senses. And so, maybe he's doing other things too, right? But he's definitely locking us down, locking us in on the idea of what she actually looked like. And so in other words, he's saying, don't just picture somebody who's a little paler than what you're used to somebody seeing. I'm talking about white like snow, white like paper, white like icing sugar. All right. And this is one really great use of simile. Sometimes you can use simile to, in more poetic or, just my love is like a red, red rose or whatever. You can do that kind of stuff. But this is just literally helping us envision in a sensory manner what's going on. Okay? And this is a great use of simile. In other words, I think when people want to develop as writers, sometimes they think, I've got to get really good. I've just got to get better at figurative language. And they rack their brains to try to come up with really smart, similes and metaphors. What you need is, if you find yourself in a moment where regular language isn't helping your reader picture what you're talking about, that's a great time to use a simile or a metaphor. I had somebody once write about she was just writing a description of a lizard peeling its own skin off. You know how they shed their skin, and she said, as he peeled it off, it made a sound like the tearing of tissue paper. And that simile, there's no sort of deeper meaning there. It just helps me picture something I didn't have any other way of picturing. So that's a great use of simile. I want you, this is really important. Think of description, think of imagery, think of figurative language, simile, metaphor, all that stuff. Don't think of it as ornamentation, okay? I want you to, the first job of imagery, the first job of figurative language is to make your descriptions more precise. All right? Don't think about, it's not that you've got, a normal sled and now I'm going to put, ornamentation on it. All those descriptions of the, I'm pointing at it, it's not there anymore, but the descriptions of the sled were giving you, that was making it more precise. It was making you better able to picture exactly what the sled looked like. The simile about the white face told you, don't picture just a pale person, picture somebody who looks like snow. And so that's what I mean when I say move toward, think in terms of precision. So, okay, I'm going to show you an example of what I'm talking about. Here's a word, truck. Picture a truck. Everybody close their eyes, picture your truck. Okay. However many people are watching this, that was about how many trucks just got pictured. Okay? Because I didn't tell you what kind of truck. That's a very imprecise thing. Now, as I go to describe that truck, it gets a little more precise, doesn't it? Blue truck. Now, those of you who were picturing yellow trucks and red trucks and black trucks, now you have to change it to a blue truck in your imagination. Blue Ford truck. Okay. Now those of you who are picturing a Chevrolet and a Nissan and all those other kinds of trucks, see, things are getting more narrow. As I describe more, I'm getting more precise. The blue Ford truck that my father gave me, now all of a sudden, with this extra description, I didn't get more ornament. It's not that my truck is now ornamented, it's that now you know exactly which truck I'm talking about. So that description has narrowed things down and made things more precise. And if you can think of your description that way, I'm not adding adjectives and adjective clauses and all my descriptors to make things more ornamented. I'm using them to make things more precise and specific. All right, and we're gonna return to this in later lessons. I've got a few more things to say about this, but it's probably time for us to wrap this one up. I look forward to seeing you in lesson 4, in which we're going to talk about dramatic irony.